I learned the truth about money the night my family decided I didn't matter. It wasn't whispered. It was announced between clinking glasses and forced laughter. And in that moment, something inside me went permanently quiet. My name is Avery Collins, and for most of my life, I was the extra chair at the table. Then when people moved, when they needed space. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a family that believed success was something you performed loudly, preferably with witnesses. My parents loved me, I think, but they loved appearances more. My older brother Ryan was the star college athlete, fraternity president, now a regional sales director with a house he could barely afford but never stopped posting about. My cousins were similar, startups, weddings, destination, vacations, constant noise. I was different. I read, I observed, I listened. After college, I took a job as an operations coordinator at a mid-sized logistics firm, making enough to live but not enough to impress anyone. I rented a one-bedroom apartment, drove a used Subaru, and kept my opinions to myself. At family gatherings, people asked what I was doing now the way you ask about the weather. Already distracted by something more interesting. What no one noticed was that my grandmother, Helen Collins, always watched me. Grandma Helen wasn't flashy. She was a retired bookkeeper who had lost my grandfather early and learned how to survive by paying attention. While everyone else talked over one another at Thanksgiving, she'd slide me a knowing look from across the room. When I visited her small ranch house on Sundays, she didn't ask about promotions or relationships. She asked how things worked, how my job functioned, how systems broke, and how people fixed them. When she needed help organizing old files or paying bills online, she called me, not Ryan. I showed up without announcing it, without taking photos, without telling anyone. Over time, she started trusting me with more than errands. She talked to me about money, about mistakes, about the quiet power of patience. She told me once, stirring sugar into her tea, that the loudest people are usually trying to convince themselves. I didn't know then that she was studying me the same way I studied processes, or that my invisibility was about to become my greatest advantage. I thought being overlooked was a flaw. A soft failure I should apologize for, but sitting there in her quiet living room, I felt something steadier forming. Not confidence exactly, but readiness. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that waits. And I had no idea that patience, once sharpened, could cut through noise, entitlement, and family myths like glass. I was about to learn what happens when silence finally speaks. And when it does, nothing stays the same. Especially the people who underestimated you. They never hear it coming, but they always feel it. In the end, so did I. I was 26 when Grandma Helen first let me see behind the curtain. Though she didn't announce it that way, it happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind that disappears from memory if it doesn't change your life. She called and asked if I could come by after work, because her printer was acting stupid again. When I arrived, the printer sat untouched, perfectly fine. Instead, she pulled a thick accordion folder from a kitchen drawers and placed it between us like a secret. Inside were neatly labeled documents, spreadsheets written in her careful handwriting, and property tax statements that made my stomach tighten. 3 duplexes, 1 small apartment building, all in working-class neighborhoods just outside downtown. She watched my face carefully as I'd flipped through the papers. "I don't want excitement," she said calmly. "I want someone who understands numbers, don't care about feelings." That night, she told me the story no one else bothered to hear. After my grandfather died, she'd quietly invested his life, insurance and savings, into real estate when interest rates were low and fear was high. She managed everything herself, fixed what needed fixing, never chased trends. By the time my family started bragging about stocks and business ideas at holiday dinners, Grandma Helen was already financially independent and alone. Ryan had no interest in boring rentals, my parents assumed. Everything would sort itself out eventually. No one asked questions. No one helped. Except me. I didn't give advice. I listened. I checked numbers. I caught errors before they became problems. Over the next 2 years, without telling anyone, I started helping her manage things, digitizing records, setting up proper bookkeeping software, handling tenant emails, coordinating repairs. I learned fast because I cared, not because I expected anything. The rest of the family stayed loud. Ryan bought a bigger house. My parents started talking about early retirement, casually referencing mom's properties as if they were already theirs. At one Christmas dinner, I heard my aunt say, "We'll probably just sell everything when the time comes, Grandma." Helen squeezed my hand under the table just once. No words. That was the moment I realized she was making a decision. Not based on love, that on reality. She wasn't sentimental about money. She was practical about people. By the time I was 29, I was effectively managing the entire portfolio while still working my day job. I never corrected anyone when they dismissed me. I never hinted at what I was doing. Grandma told me not to. "Let people show you who they are when they think you're powerless," she said. That's the truth. And they did. Every joke about my safe little job, every patronizing suggestion I should aim higher, every assumption that I would be grateful for scraps when the time came. They were writing a story where I was a background character, and I let them. Because behind the scenes, a very different story was already in motion, one that didn't need their approval to exist. The first time I realized how deeply I was underestimated, it almost made me laugh. It was at my mother's birthday dinner, a crowded restaurant with overpriced wine and too much talking. Ryan was explaining his latest commission structure like he was teaching a business class. My aunt was loudly hinting about needing money for a kitchen remodel. And my dad casually said, "When mom's properties get divided, things will be easier for all of us." No one looked at Grandma Helen when he said it. No one asked her opinion. She stared at her plate, calm, unreadable. I caught her eye and she raised one eyebrow slightly, the tiniest gesture. Message received. After that night, things accelerated quietly. Grandma asked me to attend a meeting with her attorney just to listen. The attorney, Mr. Feldman, was in his 70s and sharp as glass. He didn't waste time with small talk. He asked me direct questions about depreciation, tenant turnover, reserve funds, and long-term planning. I answered honestly, sometimes admitting I didn't know but explaining how I'd find out. Grandma watched the entire exchange without interrupting. When it was over, Mr. Feldman nodded once and said, "You understand stewardship." That's rare. On the drive home, Grandma didn't say a word. 2 weeks later, she asked me to come back. That second meeting changed everything, though nothing visibly changed at all. No announcements. No drama. Just signatures, notarized documents, and a trust structured so cleanly it felt surgical. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone. I went to work the next day like always. Answered emails, updated spreadsheets, coordinated a boiler replacement. On the outside, I was still Avery, the quiet one. On the inside, I felt the weight of responsibility settle into place. It wasn't excitement, it was clarity. Meanwhile, my family's confidence grew. Plans were made without Grandma in the room. Conversations shifted. From someday to when. Ryan talked about leveraging his future share. My parents discussed selling one building to fund travel. They never asked if Grandma wanted that. They never asked me anything at all. I stayed silent, not out of fear, but because Grandma asked me to. "People show their character when they think the ending is guaranteed," she said. "Don't interrupt them." I watched as entitlement replaced affection. Visits became shorter. Calls became transactional. And still, they spoke warmly about family loyalty, about fairness, about how we all deserve something. It was fascinating, in a detached way, to see how wisely people spend what isn't theirs. I started documenting everything, just in case. Dates, comments, assumptions, not because I planned to confront anyone. But because I was learning something important, silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it's preparation. By the time the inevitable meeting was scheduled, the one, with the group text and the ominous tone, felt strangely calm. I had already lived through the outcome in my head. Whatever happened next wouldn't define me. The work already had. And when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't need to be. Truth, I was learning, carries its own volume. The family meeting was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon, framed as just a conversation, which I knew meant decisions had already been made without us. It took place at my parents' house, the one Ryan loved to call the future gathering place once Mom's assets are sorted out. Grandma Helen wasn't invited. They said it would tire her out. That alone told me everything. I arrived early like I always did, and sat quietly while everyone else trickled in, carrying confidence like luggage they hadn't earned. There were printed notes on the coffee table, a laptop open to a spreadsheet. People spoke in percentages and hypotheticals, already emotionally spending money that did not belong to them. Ryan led the conversation naturally. He talked about maximizing value and clean exits. My aunt nodded enthusiastically. My parents looked relieved, like someone else was finally saying out loud what they'd been thinking. At one point, my mother turned to me with a soft, almost pitying smile and said, "Of course, Avery, you'll get something too. We'll make sure it's fair." Fair, the word hung in the air like a lie, dressed up as kindness. I asked one question carefully. "What does Grandma want?" The room went quiet for half a second. Then my dad waved it off. "She trusts us," he said. "She always has." That was when I knew it was time. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood up, stepped into the hallway, and made one phone call. When I returned, they were already dividing properties on the screen. 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Confusion flickered across their faces. I opened the door myself and stepped aside. Mr. Feldman entered with the calm authority of a man who had seen this kind of arrogance before and knew exactly how it ended. He introduced himself politely and asked if this was a meeting regarding the Collins family trust. No one answered. He took that as permission. What followed was not dramatic. It was precise. Documents placed gently on the table, dates, signatures, legal. Language that did not care about feelings. The trust had been executed years earlier. Ownership transferred. Authority established. Responsibility proven. I watched as confidence drained from the room in real time. Ryan stood up, angry, accusing me of betrayal. My mother cried. My father demanded explanations he was not owed. Mr. Feldman answered none of them emotionally. He answered them legally. When it was over, there was nothing left to say. I didn't smile. I didn't apologize. I simply said she chose the person who showed up, and then I left. That evening, I went to Grandma Helen's house. She was waiting, tea already poured. She didn't ask how it went. She already knew. She squeezed my hand and said, "Good, now you're free." And for the first time, I understood exactly what she meant. The fallout was immediate and relentless, like a storm that had been building for years and finally found an opening. My phone filled with messages I didn't answer, accusations dressed up as concern, rage pretending to be heartbreak. Ryan left voicemails swinging wildly between threats and guilt, calling me selfish one minute and brainwashed the next. My mother sent long texts about family unity and how Grandma would be devastated if she knew what I'd done, which was almost funny, considering she was the one who planned every detail. My father didn't yell. He went quiet, which somehow felt worse, like disappointment weaponized. I let it all sit unanswered, not out of cruelty, but because responding would have meant stepping back into a role I had already outgrown. Grandma Helen, on the other hand, was peaceful, lighter even. The tension that had lived in her shoulders for years seemed to dissolve. We spent more time together after that, not talking about money or property, but about life. She told me stories I'd never heard, mistakes she'd made, people she trusted too easily. How long it took her to learn that being needed is not the same as being loved. "They're loud because silence scares them," she said one afternoon, watching birds from her window. "You're not scared of it. That's why I trusted you." I carried those words with me like armor. I threw myself into the work, not as an escape, but as a responsibility. I formalized systems, built reserves, planned renovations that balanced value with dignity. These weren't just assets. They were homes. Families depended on them. I took that seriously. I learned how to say no to unreasonable demands, to guilt, to the idea that success must look a certain way. For the first time in my life, my quiet felt powerful instead of small. A few months later, Grandma passed away quietly in her sleep. No drama, no unfinished business. I sat with her in that still house and felt grief, yes, but also certainty. She had lived on her terms and left the world exactly as she intended. At the funeral, my family was polite and distant, grief tangled with resentment. No one approached me directly, but I felt their eyes, measuring, judging, still trying to understand how the invisible one had become immovable. Afterward, something unexpected happened. My younger cousin Emma found me outside the church. She was 20, still figuring herself out, still watching everything. "I just wanted to say," she said quietly, "I saw how you were with Grandma." I think she was. Right, that single sentence mattered more than any inheritance ever could. It told me the cycle might end somewhere. That quiet strength could be seen, even if it wasn't celebrated. Life didn't become perfect. It became honest. Smaller circle, clearer boundaries, real peace. And as the noise faded, I finally understood the lesson Grandma Helen had been teaching me all along. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You just need to be consistent, prepared, and brave enough to stand alone when the truth finally arrives. 2 years passed, not loudly but deliberately. The kind of years where progress doesn't announce itself, but compounds quietly in the background. I transitioned out of my corporate job once the management workload demanded more of me, and I did it without a goodbye post or a celebratory dinner. I built a small office inside one of the renovated properties, hired a part-time assistant, and registered a modest property management firm under my own name. Collins is residential. Nothing flashy, just functional, like everything else I believed in. Word spread slowly. Other small landlords noticed my tenant retention rates, my maintenance turnaround times, the way my buildings didn't just look better but felt better. Within a year, I was managing properties beyond my own portfolio. Income grew. Stress changed shape. I slept better than I ever had. My family, meanwhile, settled into a cold truce. We saw each other at weddings, funerals, unavoidable milestones. Polite smiles. No real conversations. Ryan avoided eye contact. My parents spoke to me like I was a distant relative instead of a daughter. I grieved that quietly too, because acknowledging it didn't change it. What surprised me was how little resentment I carried. Distance gave me perspective. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply stopped letting them take from me. One afternoon, my father asked to meet. Coffee, neutral territory. He talked about forgiveness, about time healing wounds, about how hard it had been watching the family fracture. I listened like I always had. Then he said it. "Maybe you could help Ryan out a bit, just until he's back on his feet." There it was, the same entitlement repackaged as reconciliation. I told him no calmly, explained that help without accountability isn't generosity, it's enabling. He didn't like that. He stood up, disappointed again. This time, I let him leave. Not all connections broke. Emma started working with me part-time while finishing school. She asked questions. She learned. She listened. Watching her grow reminded me why Grandma had done what she did. Legacy isn't money. It's values that survive pressure. I mentored her the way Grandma had mentored me, not with speeches but with standards. On the 3rd anniversary of Grandma's passing, I bought another building. Needed work. Good bones. I stood in the empty hallway and smiled. The quiet was familiar now. Comforting. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was simply uninterested in performing. And that, I realized, was the real inheritance. Success didn't change my personality, but it did change my perspective. I started noticing how differently people behaved once they realized I wasn't behind anymore. Contractors returned calls faster. Bankers spoke slower, more carefully. New acquaintances listened instead of interrupting. It was unsettling at first, realizing how much of respect in this country is conditional, tied not to character, but to perceived value. I didn't lean into it. If anything, I leaned away. I kept my clothes simple, my schedule full, my circle small. I learned that privacy is a form of power, especially for women who were once underestimated. Running Collins Residential became more than a business. It became a standard. I refused shortcuts. I paid fair wages. I kept rents competitive without exploiting desperation. When tenants struggled, I worked with them within reason. When they took advantage, I acted decisively. That balance took time to learn, but once I found it, everything stabilized. My properties stopped feeling like liabilities and started functioning like ecosystems, predictable, sustainable, alive, other. Landlords asked how I did it. I told them the truth. Consistency beats intensity every time. Most didn't want to hear that. They wanted hacks. I offered habits. One evening, after a long day, I found an old voicemail from my mother I'd never opened. It was dated months earlier. She sounded tired, older than I remembered. She said she hoped I was well. That was it. No guilt, no request. Just that. I sat with it for a while, then saved it. Not because I planned to call back, but because it reminded me that people are complicated, even the ones who fail us. I didn't need closure to move forward. I needed clarity, and I had that. Emma graduated that spring and joined the company full-time. Watching her take ownership of projects, make mistakes, recover, and improve felt like watching a loop close. She didn't idolize me. She worked, and I respected her for it. One day she asked, "Do you ever regret how things ended with them?" I thought about it carefully. "I regret that it had to be revealed the way it was," I said, "but I don't regret the truth." On the 5th anniversary of Grandma Helen's trust, I visited her grave alone. I told her about the new buildings, the company, Emma. I thanked her again. Not for the money, but for seeing me before I learned how to see myself. As I walked away, I felt something settle, not triumph. Not victory, but alignment. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. I used to think being overlooked meant being small. Now I know it just means people are looking in the wrong direction. And sometimes letting them is the smartest move you'll ever make. By the time the business stabilized into something that could run, without my constant oversight, I finally understood what Grandma Helen had been protecting me from all along: the need for validation. For most of my life, I thought being unseen was a punishment, something I needed to fix by becoming louder, brighter, more impressive. But standing in that season of quiet success, I saw the truth clearly. Being unseen had given me space to grow without interference. No one rushed me. No one tried to reshape me into something useful for them. While others performed, I prepared. I started saying no more often, not just to people, but to expectations I'd absorbed without questioning. I didn't need to expand faster. I didn't need to chase prestige clients or flashy partnerships. When offers came with conditions that felt misaligned, I declined them politely and without explanation. That alone shocked people, especially men who were used to women over-justifying every boundary. I learned that confidence doesn't argue. It decides. Collins's Residential grew steadily, not explosively, and that was intentional. I kept my standards high and my workload humane. I paid attention to the small things: lighting in hallways, response times, how tenants felt when they spoke to us. Reputation followed naturally. One afternoon, a local housing nonprofit reached out to partner on maintaining affordable units. It wasn't the most profitable deal on paper, but it felt right. Grandma had believed deeply that dignity wasn't optional. I signed the agreement without hesitation. That decision brought me more peace than any revenue spike ever could. Every so often, someone from my past would reappear with curiosity disguised as friendliness. Old classmates, distant relatives, people who once overlooked me and now wanted proximity. I stayed cordial but distant. I'd learned the difference between reconnection and access seeking. The latter always came with questions about scale. Numbers, what's next? I stopped answering those. My life wasn't a case study. One night, after locking up the office, I sat alone and thought about the girl. I used to be the one who shrank herself at tables, who spoke softly to avoid being corrected, who believed worth was something granted by louder people. I wished I could tell her this. Silence isn't absence. It's incubation, and when you finally emerge, you don't owe the world an explanation. I didn't rebuild my family. I rebuilt myself, and that made all the difference. The quiet no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like home, like control, like alignment. And for the first time, I wasn't bracing for the next confrontation or disappointment. I was simply moving forward, intentionally, grounded in work that mattered and values that didn't bend under pressure. That's when I realized the story was never about inheritance or money or betrayal. It was about choosing who you become when no one is watching. Everything else was just noise. The last lesson came quietly, the way all real ones do. It arrived on an ordinary morning as I stood in the doorway of a newly renovated building. Sunlight hitting clean floors. The hum of life returning to a space that had been neglected for years. Tenants were moving in that afternoon. Kids' voices echoed down the hall. Someone laughed. I realized then that success, real success, doesn't feel like a finish line. It feels like usefulness, like being exactly where you're meant to be, doing work that makes sense to your bones. I thought about my family less often now, not because the hurt had vanished completely, but because it no longer defined me. Distance had done what confrontation never could clarified things. Some people will only love you as long as they can benefit from you. Others will only respect you once they can't control you. Neither group gets to decide your worth. I stopped replaying old conversations in my head, stopped imagining alternate endings where they understood me. Understanding, I learned, is not a requirement for peace. Emma knocked on the doorframe that morning, holding a clipboard, confident, capable. Watching her step into responsibility without entitlement felt like the truest continuation of Grandma Helen's legacy. Not money passed down, but judgment passed on, discernment, patience, the courage to be underestimated without internalizing it. I smiled at her and said, "Let's open the doors," and we did. That night, I went home to my quiet apartment, poured a glass of wine, and sat by the window. No chaos, no performance, just calm. I thought about how many years I'd spent believing I needed permission to take up space, to make decisions, to protect what mattered to me. The truth was simpler and harder. Permission was never coming. You either take responsibility for your life, or someone else will try to manage it for you. If there's one thing my story proves, it's this. Being quiet doesn't mean being weak. It means you're listening, watching, learning, and when the moment comes, the noise collapses under its own. Wait, you'll already be standing on solid ground, prepared, unmoved, free. I raised my glass, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. To Grandma Helen, to the invisible years, to the strength built in silence, and to the woman I became when I finally stopped trying to be seen by people who never bothered to look. That was the real ending. Not revenge, not victory, just peace. And it was more than enough.